knocker-ups. Back in Victorian England, alarm clocks weren't something everyone had sitting on their nightstand. So people hired what were basically human alarm clocks, the knocker-ups. Their job was to walk the streets at ungodly hours and literally knock on people's windows with a long stick or even shoot peas at the glass until the poor worker inside woke up. It was cheap too, just a penny or two a week, and whole families sometimes worked as knocker-ups together. Some factories even paid them to wake up entire shifts of workers at once. And imagine this, the job stuck around well into the 20th century, long after trains, electricity, and industrial machines had taken over everyday life. Sin eater. Back in medieval Europe, death wasn't just about the body, it was about the soul. People believed you could literally transfer sins from the dead onto someone else, and that's where the sin eater came in. The idea was simple, but super creepy. When someone died, food and drink would be placed on the body. Then the sin eater would come in, eat the bread and drink the ale, and according to belief, absorb all the dead person's sins. That way the soul of the deceased could pass into the afterlife clean. Of course, this meant the sin eater became spiritually dirty with every job. They were shunned, avoided, and treated like outcasts. Nobody wanted to sit next to the person carrying the sins of the whole village. It was a desperate, poverty-driven job, but some people made a living from it for centuries. The practice lingered in rural parts of Britain and Wales up until the 19th century. Groom of the stool. Now this might just be the weirdest royal job ever. In Tudor England, kings didn't exactly have much privacy even in the bathroom. That's where the groom of the stool came in. The groom's duty was, well, to help the king with his bathroom needs. Yup, literally wiping the king's butt. But this wasn't even seen as gross or lowly. It was actually a super prestigious role. Why? Because it meant you had unmatched access to the king. You were with him in his most private moments, heard his secrets, and could whisper advice no one else dared to give. Many grooms ended up becoming powerful political figures because of that closeness. So yeah, helping the king on the toilet could actually be a career booster. Resurrectionist. In the 1700s and 1800s, medical schools were desperate for cadavers to dissect, but there was one big problem. It was illegal to sell bodies, and only executed criminals were legally available. That's where the resurrectionists came in, better known as grave robbers. These guys would sneak into cemeteries at night, dig up freshly buried bodies, and sell them to anatomy professors and medical students for a tidy profit. And the demand was so high, it basically became an underground industry. Some gangs even had price lists, with young healthy bodies fetching the most money. It got so bad that families started guarding graves with iron cages called more safes, or even hired armed watchmen to protect loved ones from being stolen. The job was dangerous, illegal, and pretty disturbing, but it kept medical science alive, literally. Without them, doctors wouldn't have had the hands-on practice they needed. Leech collector. Back in the 1800s, medicine loved one thing above all else: bloodletting. And for that, you needed leeches. Lots of them. Enter the leech collector. Their job was as grim as it sounds. Collectors would wade into ponds, marshes, and swamps, letting dozens of leeches latch onto their bare legs and arms. Once the leeches had their fill, the collectors would peel them off and sell them to doctors and apothecaries. It was painful, messy, and often dangerous. Leeches could carry infections, and constant blood loss sometimes left collectors weak or ill. But with the medical world obsessed with leech therapy, believing it cured everything from headaches to fevers, there was always money to be made. The job faded as medicine advanced, but for a while it was considered an essential trade. So yeah, some people really did get paid to let bloodsuckers feed on them. Whipping boy. Imagine being best friends with a prince, but with one huge catch. Whenever he misbehaved, you got punished instead. That was the job of the whipping boy. Since a prince's body was considered sacred and couldn't be beaten by teachers or servants, someone else had to take the lashes. So a boy of the same age was raised alongside the young royal. If the prince slacked off in lessons or acted out, the whipping boy got the cane. The whole idea was that seeing his friend suffer would make the prince feel guilty and behave better. Did it always work? Probably not. But hey, the whipping boy often got a royal education, and sometimes the friendship paid off later in life when the prince grew up and rewarded him. Fuller. Doing laundry in ancient Rome was not your average chore. Enter the fuller, basically the professional laundry worker of the empire. But here's the weird part. Their secret cleaning ingredient was urine. Yep, urine was prized for its ammonia content, which helped whiten togas and clean stains. Romans actually had jars placed around the city so people could donate their pee, which the fullers then collected. The job itself was rough. Fullers would dump the clothes into vats of water mixed with urine and then stomp on them barefoot, kind of like people stomping grapes for wine, except way less glamorous. After that, they'd rinse and dry the clothes before returning them to their owners. It was smelly, dirty, and definitely not the most respected job, but it kept Roman citizens looking sharp in their bright white togas. And yes, there was even a urine tax at one point because the business was so profitable. Dog whipper. Going to church in medieval Europe wasn't always the peaceful, quiet scene you might imagine. People often brought their dogs along, and of course, the dogs did what dogs do, barking, fighting, and causing chaos during the service. That's where the dog whipper came in. Armed with a long stick, a whip, or sometimes a pair of tongs, this church official's whole job was to chase disruptive dogs out of the building. It sounds funny now, but it was considered an important role. A misbehaving dog could distract the entire congregation or even interrupt the priest mid-sermon. So the dog whipper kept order, making sure worship went smoothly. The job eventually faded away as rules tightened and pets were banned from churches, but for centuries it was a real occupation. Mourning bride. Funerals today are usually quiet, with close family and friends grieving. But in the past, death was a performance, and sometimes you needed to hire the actors. Enter the professional mourner, sometimes called a mourning bride. In ancient China, families believed that loud, dramatic wailing helped guide the soul of the dead into the afterlife. So women were paid to cry, scream, beat their chests, and collapse in sorrow, even if they'd never met the deceased. The more noise, the more respect it showed. Fast forward to Victorian England, and the idea lived on. Hired mourners would dress in heavy black veils, join funeral processions, and sob dramatically on cue. For the family, it was a way to show off social status, because if dozens of people were weeping at your funeral, clearly you must have been important. For poor women, this bizarre role was one of the few jobs available that paid cash. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave them a way to survive. Human alarm bell. Before alarm clocks and even before public clock towers, most people had no reliable way of knowing the time. That's where the human alarm bell came in, a walking, shouting timepiece. In ancient Rome and later in medieval towns, people were hired to call out the hours of the night or early morning. Some carried handbells to make extra noise, while others just used their lungs, shouting things like, "The third hour has passed!" These cries didn't just mark time, they were wake-up calls for bakers, market sellers, or workers who needed to get moving before dawn. In some places, the job was combined with being a night watchman. That meant patrolling the streets, calling the time, and at the same time keeping an eye out for fires, thieves, or drunk troublemakers. The classic phrase, "all's well," often came from these watchmen after every hourly shout, reassuring townsfolk that nothing dangerous was happening. Payment varied. Sometimes they were employed by the city council to keep order, other times by private households who wanted a personal time caller outside their window. And like the knocker-ups of later centuries, they became a familiar sound in communities where keeping time meant keeping society running. The profession slowly died out as church bells, clock towers, and eventually personal clocks made human time shouting unnecessary.